Welcome aboard! Join us as we dive into the legendary battleships of the two world wars, exploring their history, firepower, and the battles that would shape naval warfare. So let's set sail into the past. In the closing years of the 19th century, France stood at a crossroads. Once a dominant maritime power, its navy now lagged behind other rising giants. The Royal Navy of Britain held firm control over the seas, while Imperial Germany, Japan, and even Italy were modernizing rapidly. The once glorious French fleet, a symbol of national prestige and global influence, had become fragmented, aging, and technologically outpaced. Then, in 1906, Britain did something no one expected. It launched a ship that redefined naval warfare forever. That ship was the HMS Dreadnought, armed with 10 12-inch guns, powered by new revolutionary steam turbines, and faster than anything of her kind. The Dreadnought rendered every battleship before her obsolete. A new arms race had now begun. France, stunned and unprepared, scrambled to respond. The French naval doctrine was still focused on cruiser warfare, colonial defense, and commerce raiding. Its battleship development had stalled, limited by outdated thinking, internal political struggles, and budgetary chaos, but the world would not wait. By 1910, the French Navy had finally begun to shake off its indecision. The Corbett-class, its first generation of dreadnoughts, was laid down in 1910, years behind its rivals. These ships were serviceable, but already outdated compared to British or German designs. They carried 12 12-inch guns but were heavily constrained by France's limited shipyard capacities and tight naval funding. Still, the Corbettes were a start. And from that start, something more ambitious would emerge, the Bretagne-class. Named after the historic province of Brittany, the Bretagne-class would be France's second and final dreadnought class before the First World War. It would reflect not just a new design, but a nation finally coming to terms with modern naval warfare. The idea behind Bretagne was simple: more firepower, more protection, more range. But as always, the execution was anything but simple. In 1912, the French Naval General Staff finalized the design. 3 ships would be built: Bretagne, Provence, and Lorraine. Their names echoed the proud regions of France, invoking national unity in a time of political uncertainty. In order to accommodate the larger weapons without lengthening the ship, basic compromises needed to be made. The Bretagne-class battleships were built under restrictive limits not of vision, but of facilities. Huge dry dock rooms were not present in France's large naval docks, like the ones at Lorraine and Brest. The hull could not be lengthened or widened all that easily without requiring enormous, costly renovations of harbour facilities. So the architects worked within the minimum hull specifications of the older Corbett class. But there was a loophole. The Bretagne-class was to be fitted with 340mm guns, bigger and heavier than the Corbett's 305mm guns. To fit the added weight and internal needs of these 340mm guns, something had to be cut, and that would be firepower. Compared to the Corbett's, which had 6 twin turrets, 12 guns in total, the Bretagne-class had 5 twin turrets, 10 guns in total. The turret distribution was carefully remodeled. A turret amidships from the Corbett, her middle one, to be exact, had to be sacrificed for the heavier gun armament, boilers, and critical machinery. This only left the 5-turret scheme: 2 ahead turrets as a superfiring pair, 1 amidships between the funnels, and 2 aft, also in superfiring arrangement. It did provide some fore and aft distribution of fire, but at a cost. With more weight at the ends of the ship, the Bretagne-class were also ill-mannered in the sea. They were never entirely stable. In rough seas, they rolled and pitched noticeably more than the preceding ships. They were thus less comfortable to maneuver and more difficult to modernize later in life. The internal space was cramped too. The room gained from the removal of a turret was quickly filled with larger shell handling rooms, reinforced barbettes, and reinforced structural supports. There wasn't much room for innovation or change. These ships were formidable in their day, but rigidly fixed in design, and yet the guns they carried were still potent. Each of the 340mm model 1912 guns could fire a huge 884-kilogram shell, almost 1,950 pounds, at a muzzle velocity of more than 800 meters per second. At maximum elevation, they could strike targets more than 20 kilometers distant. Against modern armor, they were a serious threat. In a line of battle, these guns could deliver a fatal blow to any capital ship within range. This was France's response to the arms race, even if it had been accompanied by compromise. Even if it were not as elegant as British or German engineering, the Bretagne-class battleships were nonetheless a step in the right direction, teeming with steel, with power, and with the subdued defiance of a navy fighting to keep pace with the future. They were not perfect, but they were unyielding, and soon they would be needed. When the First World War broke out in August 1914, Bretagne-class battleships were still under construction, and when finally they came into commission, the war's great sea battles had already passed. The Battle of Jutland, the only great battle of dreadnought fleets in World War I, took place in May 1916. France, preoccupied with the terrestrial war on Germany, did not participate. Her battleships remained in the Mediterranean, protecting an increasingly tranquil front. Bretagne, the lead of her class, commissioned in September 1915. Provence commissioned in March 1916, and Lorraine joined towards the end of the same year. At this point, the Mediterranean was a sea of patrolling and blockades. Rather than large battles, Austro-Hungarian Navy, France's most important naval competitor in the area, was all but idle, stuck within the Adriatic Sea. Italian, French, and British units closed a tight blockade over the Strait of Otranto, aimed at preventing hostile warships and submarines from slipping out into the wider Mediterranean. The Bretagne-class battleships were assigned to the 1st Battle Division of the French Mediterranean Fleet, which was based at Corfu and later Madras. They escorted these missions for containment primarily. They were involved in action hardly at all, but that does not mean that they did nothing. The vessels stayed at alert in harsh conditions. Crews practiced, trained, and maintained their ships in often distant and underdeveloped ports. The strain of constant coal burning and added Mediterranean heat tested their engines. Supply lines were long, maintenance resources were limited, and morale was always a concern. Submarines were an ever-present danger. The Central Powers employed U-boats in the Mediterranean, targeting merchant shipping and escort vessels. Battleships were rarely their target, but they could never remain relaxed, always changing position, always screened by smaller escorts. These were years of unobtrusive duty, years of wearing down. But by November 1918, the end of war, the Bretagne-class ships still afloat, unscathed and operational. They had survived their first war, and now, in the years of doubtful peace that followed, they would be faced with an even newer challenge: obsolescence. The 1920s and 1930s were decades of great change in naval warfare. The Washington Naval Treaty in 1922 imposed strict limits on the building of capital ships. France, along with Britain, the United States, Italy, and Japan, agreed to halt the building of new battleships and restrict naval tonnage. The treaty froze the French fleet of battleships in time, and it was forced to make do with the ships it had. The Bretagne-class would remain on frontline service, yet they were increasingly outdated. More recent foreign vessels, the British Queen Elizabeth-class, for example, or the American Colorado-class, were faster, better protected, and often converted to burn oil instead of coal. France's coal-burning dreadnoughts were slow, heavy, and expensive to operate. The French Navy was quite conscious of this. There were modest refits carried out in all three vessels from 1921 to 1925. These included modification of their superstructure, the modernization of rangefinders and fire control systems, and some minor internal adjustments. All this, however, was limited in nature. The vessels continued to be coal-fired, continued to be unstable in rough seas, and continued to be hampered by cramped internal arrangements. There was nevertheless an exception. Lorraine, the junior in the class, was chosen for a higher level of modernization. She was taken in hand from 1921 to 1922 for a major refit. Her dual coal and oil-firing boilers replaced her original coal-fired ones, which provided a slight improvement in efficiency. Even more significant though, her amidships turret between the funnels was removed. This was a major change. The room gained by removing the center turret was used to fit out aviation facilities. A catapult and crane were provided for Lorraine to launch and recover a Gudou, Laser seaplane, with other types of observation added subsequently. Lorraine therefore became the first French battleship capable of launching and recovering aircraft, but within limitations. Though she now mounted only 8 main guns instead of 10, Lorraine proved more valuable as a fleet scout and gun spotter. Her sisters, Bretagne and Provence, were not so treated. Budgetary considerations and the minimal value of modernizing vessels that were already obsolescent likely had something to do with it. Still, the Bretagne-class continued in service. In the 1920s and 1930s, they were regularly employed on training cruises, goodwill visits, and overseas station duties. They represented France at naval reviews, supported colonial garrisons, and patrolled the Western Mediterranean, but their age started to catch up with them. Their speed, barely 20 knots, was sluggish for the interwar years. Their fire control systems were outdated. Their armor, once respectable, could now be pierced by newer naval artillery, and more significantly, by bombs from aircraft. The shadow of air power was growing year by year. The rise of the aircraft carrier, and with it, the bomber and the torpedo plane, was reshaping the very nature of naval warfare. Battleships were no longer the sole masters of the seas. Now, they were vulnerable, and with inadequate air defenses or high speed, the Bretagne-class was particularly exposed. France knew this. During the late 1930s, there were even more modernizations on the way. Between 1935 and 1937, Bretagne and Provence underwent refits intended to enhance their utility. These consisted of new fire control, improved secondary batteries, and, in an acknowledgement of contemporary threats, anti-aircraft guns. Despite this, their inherent defects could not be fixed. They were still coal-burning, their hulls were still cramped, their armor was outdated, and they had no defense against the latest technological horror of the day. But for all their faults, these ships continued to serve their purpose, and in the late 1930s, Europe was sliding again towards war. Germany had rearmed. Italy had become bellicose. Japan was spreading in the Pacific. And France, shaken by political upheaval and economic depression, had no new battleships to replace the old dreadnoughts. The Bretagne-class were antiquated. When war broke out in 1939, the 3 old veterans, Bretagne, Provence, and Lorraine, were brought back to the line. Again, they would not last until the end of the war, but they would not go quietly. Their final chapter was about to begin. By September 1939, the world was once again at war. Germany's invasion of Poland had goaded Britain and France into action. The great European powers were once again fighting in a brutal conflict. And once again, the old French battleships, ships once symbols of national prestige, were being called into service. The Bretagne-class was no longer cutting edge. Not even close, but they were the only battleships France had in numbers. Bretagne, Provence, and Lorraine were recalled to frontline duty with the Forster raid, France's rapid naval striking force at Brest and later Mers-el-Kébir in French Algeria. Their initial operations were prudent. They escorted convoys, guarded the Atlantic approaches, and patrolled the Western Mediterranean. They were there largely symbolically, a warning to Italian or German naval action. But their age and sluggish speed made them already vulnerable, especially to the growing threat from the air. But the real test did not come from Germany or Italy, it came from Britain. In June 1940, France capitulated. The sudden collapse of French resistance, just 6 weeks after the German invasion, shocked the world. The great French army had been defeated. Paris was occupied. The French government, under Marshal Pétain, signed an armistice with Germany. But France's navy, La Marine Nationale, was still intact. It was nevertheless one of the world's largest fleets. Over 60 large warships, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers remained in French hands. Most of them were tied up in harbors like Toulon, Alexandria, and Mers-el-Kébir in Algeria. This was a gas to Britain. What if German hands came to possess those ships? Even though the armistice condition stated that France would keep its navy under national command and would not hand ships over to Germany, Winston Churchill was not ready to take any chance. With Germany gaining control of the French fleet, it would shift the balance of European naval power. And so, Churchill came to a tough decision: Operation Catapult. On the 3rd of July, 1940, the Royal Navy delivered an ultimatum to the French warships anchored in Mers-el-Kébir. There were 4 options: 1. Join the British and continue to fight. 2. Steam to a British port and be interned. 3. Disarm on British orders. Or number 4. Be sunk. The French refused. They believed their honor, and the armistice demanded that they withstand foreign pressure. They dallied, negotiating, but no agreement was made, and thus, on that sweltering afternoon, the Royal Navy's guns were laid in. The bombardment lasted just over 10 minutes. The British fleet, led by the powerful battlecruiser HMS Hood and battleships like Valiant and Resolution, pressed home hard and fast. The French ships were moored in close, with no room to maneuver. The seasoned Bretagne, moored near the point of the harbour, was struck soon afterwards. One or several of her magazines was penetrated by 1 or more shells. Disaster and panic ensued. At 6:19 p.m., Bretagne exploded in a great fireball. Her forward magazine blew with such force that the ship rolled hard to port and sank in less than 2 minutes. The ship was torn apart. Of her crew, over 1,000 men were killed. Only a few hundred survived. It was one of the most lethal single-ship casualty events in French naval history. Provence, lying at anchor nearby, was also hit. She received a number of direct shell hits and ignited. She did not explode like Bretagne, but was badly damaged and began to settle on the shallow bottom of the harbour. Her crew managed to salvage the ship from total loss, and she was subsequently refloated and sent to Toulon for repairs. The newer French coastal defence battleship, Dunkerque, also suffered severe damage in the attack. A link to that video is in the description. But to the French, this was treason. To the British, it was a grave necessity. The action provoked colossal tension between the two powers. Even in British ranks, the morality of the act was called into question. But the warning was inescapable. The Royal Navy would never allow the French fleet to fall into German hands, and the Bretagne-class had paid the price. Lorraine, the third and last of her class, was not exempt from disaster. She had been separated beforehand and was in Alexandria, Egypt, anchored with Force X, under Admiral Godefroy. Upon the British making Operation Catapult, negotiations in Alexandria took on a different face. Rather than forcing a bloody conflict, British Admiral Cunningham and Admiral Godefroy came to a peaceful agreement. Lorraine opted to disarm and be placed under guard with the other French vessels in Alexandria. They were technically in French hands but now posed no threat to British interests. For the moment, Lorraine's guns fell silent, but her story wasn't over yet. In 1943, after the Allied invasions of North Africa and the collapse of the Vichy North African government, Lorraine saw combat again, this time as part of the Free French Naval Forces in the service of Charles de Gaulle and the Allies. Rearmed again in early 1944, Lorraine was equipped with new anti-aircraft gear and radar. Her primary armament was still present on board, although by this point, it was mostly useful for shore bombardment. In June 1944, Lorraine assisted Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France, with naval gunfire support. Off Provence, her 340mm guns thundered once more, firing at German coastal defences to support the landings. Later in the year, Lorraine also assisted off the Italian coast. She was then over 28 years old, slow, outgunned by newer vessels, and surviving only through modernizations and good fortune. But in those final war years, she still served with determination. She was broken up in 1954, and with her the Bretagne-class disappeared into the past. They were never the best known or most modern. They fought no great battles and never made world headlines. They were built as France's answer to an international arms race, but arrived too late to fight in one world war, and were too old for the next. Their story is nevertheless one of determination. They fought in 2 world wars. They carried the tricolour of France across oceans, from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic. And when the world turned against them, when even their allies fired on them, they stood fast. Bretagne went down with her guns stilled and honour intact. Provence was blasted, refitted, and then sent to the bottom to avoid capture. Lorraine stood through both wars, fired her last shots in victory, and vanished into peace. They were relics of a lost time, but for a while, they were France's sword in the sea, and though the oceans no longer resonate with their cannons, their names still live, written on metal, on stillness, and in sacrifice. Remember, subscribing is totally free, it helps our channel grow and we appreciate it immensely. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. You can also explore our channel for other battleship videos. Goodbye for now, and Godspeed.